components, and gender being the cultural, the learned, the behavioral components in terms of those things that differentiate us between men and women. So masculinity, right, is oriented on the gender side, right, on the culture, on the learned side of things. And we're really interested in looking in terms of, what does masculinity mean to us? How do those meanings influence the way that we see ourselves? How do those meanings influence the way we conceptualize our relationships? And those sorts of questions. So I think value to looking at masculinity. The other thing that's important to consider here, masculinity is a topic that's becoming more, you might say, popular in contemporary social scientific research. It's something that was, to some extent, overlooked in the past with regards to gender analysis. But it's really important to consider that when you think about gender, we're not just talking about the feminine, but there's also the masculine, of course. That these two things surely inform each other in really important ways. So if we're really interested in women's issues and women's rights and women's roles, then we also need to at the same time explore what men's roles are, what men's rights are and privileges are, so that we can really have what we say a deconstructive approach to looking at these, you might say, binary machines, right, in the way that they're producing different kinds of people through one sort of apparatus of gender. So it really becomes important that even for young women to think about this topic of masculinity and how it's impacting your life and your relationships, etc. as well. Plus, there's some really interesting contemporary challenges going on with masculinity. What it means to be a man is no longer as straightforward as it once was, if ever it really was straightforward. But surely there's a lot of ways of contestation over what it means to be a man, what you should do or what you should act like if you're going to act like a man. So there's really important to really explore this topic and figure out how does masculinity really make a difference in terms of our lives. There's some particularly interesting challenges, I think, that a lot of young men face these days. Things like you're expected to be sensitive, right? But if you're too sensitive, then you're a sissy, right? You're expected to be somewhat sexually reserved. But if you're too reserved, then you're, then there's something wrong with you, right? You're gay or you're passive or something like that, right? If you're supposed to be respectful in your relationships, but if you're too attentive, then you're whipped, right? So there's these really interesting sort of challenges that we end up having to negotiate, very similar to some of the issues pertaining gender and sexuality that young women end up having to face. So I think having a really introspective look at ourselves and our culture in terms of masculinity and how these things are informing each other, both on the cultural level and the personal level, how would you say, allows us to look at ourselves in a more sort of a genuine light, to sort of open up ourselves in a way that can be more strategic and potentially more fruitful, considering the relationships and the situations that we find ourselves in. Maybe just because I know I'm going to be asking you to share some of your own stories. Hopefully you'll have them later on. Everybody heard this phrase before, at least? Yeah. Somewhere? Miller Lite commercials, for example. Man, tell me no when you decide you want a beer that tastes good, and take off your skirt, and I'll give you a beer. Man Up kind of commercial, or all sorts of pop culture commercials or movies where in some form or another, a man is told to man up or act like a man or be a man or something like that. Probably something that's not really foreign to a lot of us, at least. But I think there's something really interesting about this particular phrase that I think captures some of the really important aspects of masculinity and some sort of role in our contemporary culture. One thing is it sort of draws our attention to the fact that masculinity is a kind of a performance. It's something that we do. It's something that we enact in our relationships, and a lot of times strategically or intentionally, so that we can sort of display or present ourselves as a man to meet social expectations, to form a particular type of relationships, to fit in with particular types of social groups. And these things are really powerful in the way that they come to drive the sorts of things we do, in the way that we relate to other people. Also, I think there's something interesting, too, here that it's almost satirical or comical, a lot of the ways that we use this man up. And people might use it, how would you say, to poke fun at themselves or a situation when they're saying this. And I think, again, that sort of reveals some of our anxiety or tension with regard to masculinity, right? The sort of a, potentially anyway, you can tell me later, privileged sort of a role in our society that we're trying to hold on to in some sense, even though we know at another level that it's all sort of culturally constructed. I mean, there's no sort of natural or necessary basis for male privilege in this particular type of a cultural arrangement. So in that, there's sort of anxiety that I think comes with this exhortation to tell a man to man up, to act like a man, to fulfill your socially expected sorts of roles. Testosterone is actually generated through aggressive behavior, and so what we can see is that sort of encouraging young people, you know, whatever people we're talking about in our culture, particularly boys, right, to really engage in aggressive sort of relationships with other boys is potentially increasing the production of testosterone, right, and thus having a lot of physiological, outcomes of that, so that when we look at these sort of natural differences between men and women in regard to their personality and how those might relate to testosterone, those still could be those sort of physical effects of the cultural construction of gender in this context. Now, the other part of your question I think is really interesting regarding how it is that we might be promoting aggressive types of behaviors as a way of, managing male relationships, right? And so maybe partly what you're saying is that that sort of encouraging men, to be aggressive, is somehow at the foundation of the way, the influence of testosterone in that sort of sphere of male intimacy. I think there's something that to be explored there, but again, I would still look at that, I would anyway, look at that as a sort of a result of a cultural or social process, right, sort of generating these sort of different identities, different groups of people, different subject activities, and then the expectations that come along with that also. I don't know if to connect with this, at least in my youth, I recall one of the most hurtful insults that you could lob at another boy is to say, you're a sissy, or you're a pussy, or stop being a little girl, or you'll even hear the governor of the state of California, the former, saying, you're an economic girly man, or things like that, right? Whereas trying to make this clear distinction between, you know, being strong and tough and assertive and dominant and whatnot, right, as being masculine, and these other sort of characteristics as being in the feminine. And I don't know, does that still prove true? Do people still, men in particular, still insult each other, calling each other women, or don't be a pussy, or those sorts of things? Like, how often is this happening?
It's the worst thing you can call a man nowadays.
It's still
acting like a little bitch.
Acting like a little bitch. Is that pretty much the worst thing that somebody can say to you these days?
Yep. I guess so.
Think so? Interesting. So at least in that regard, right, we're still in this territory where we have a lot of gender tension here, and that this is surely revealing some of those deep meanings about what it means to be a man, the sort of expectations of masculinity. Like, what is the context of what people are telling us this? I mean, what's going on? That something's happening, that you're called a sissy or something like that. What's that? Showing fear.
You're a man and you're afraid, you're a pussy.
Showing fear, showing any kind of emotion at all. Okay, that's really interesting. We agreeing, we disagreeing. If we have disagreement, let's throw it out there. If we have agreement, let's maybe throw. You can just nod, or it could yes, we got some nods over here. Anybody else have a story along these lines about what it means to be a man? A man should be in control of, in this case, in a lot of cases, of women. In particular, the women in this man's life, right? The man should be in control of the situation, should be in control of the relationship, should be in control of the car. How many guys do I know that will never let their wife drive a car? Right? It's like a badge of masculinity, right? That I'm not going to let my woman drive the car. I'm the one who's going to take care, I'm going to take control of the vehicle, and I don't want my wife to drive for, well, they'll probably rationalize it in a lot of reasons. She's a shitty driver, or women get in accidents, or whatever, all kinds of things like that, right? But it's probably more, right? That's sort of a really deeply rooted, psychologically, compelling desire to be in control, right? As a sort of an expression of your manly role in a relationship. So, like, going back to what you were saying too, right? If you're giving too much control in the relationship up, you might say, then it's sort of cause for teasing, cause for that sort of ridicule that can happen. Relationships as men, and where we're that threshold of having a good manly sort of a marriage or relationship or a sexual relationship versus what would you say when you're going too far into spending too much time with your wife, whatever. You're not supposed to do lovey-dovey cupcake.
At least not in front of me.
Okay.
Yeah. Sweet.
Very good. Very interesting. Anybody else have any thoughts or comments along that line?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, go for it.
So how much of it is a fear about being seen as a woman, and how much of it is just good old-fashioned homophobia? What do you think?
What do y'all think? Yeah.
I think it's, I think they're very much overlapping because a lot of homophobia is that they see like penetrating partner as male and like receiving as female. So if you're, not to be crude, but if like they see that as being in a woman's role, like if you're being penetrated by another dude, so it's, oh, you're being like a woman now.
I mean, there's some there are a number of really interesting things in what you're saying, and I think maybe those two go hand in hand, right? Because I think it's in some way one of the things that we say about masculinity now is to be manly, you should not be like a woman, as you were mentioning earlier. But also being manly is also being not queer. Right? And somehow we think of being gay or being queer as being more feminine, right? I mean, and as soon as we see a man who seems to act more feminine, we immediately think gay, right? Although a lot of times that's absolutely not true. Gay men are plenty masculine. They have plenty of gay men have orientation towards masculinity, maybe even more so, and certainly in some cases more so than straight men. So I think it's probably both at the same time, and that those things are mutually informing each other in terms of the way that we're thinking about ourselves and the things that we should not become. And in some sense, what the whole man up saying is like obfuscating, right? As we're saying, don't be a queer, don't be a fag, and don't be a woman. Don't be a sissy, right? And sort of the man up phrase is a sort of a nice sort of catch-all to really be able to say those things without really having to articulate those somewhat crass sort of comments, you know? Yeah. A couple of you, and I think you're right on target and some really interesting and important things. I still think there's more study that needs to be done on that particular dynamic. But I think what you're saying, in some sense, has to be true, right? That the more and more the things seem to be becoming equal, right, in our relationships, in our workplaces and whatnot, and ideally, right, I mean, realistically and materially, they are and should be, right? I mean, like incrementally a little bit maybe, but so it seems like you're saying, symbolically and psychologically and interpersonally, they seem to be going the opposite direction.
Right,
you know?
especially as women are making, I mean, there's a lot more households now that the woman is the primary breadwinner and the man is not. So there's this masculinity, this idea of I take care of my family and my wallet defines my masculinity.
Right.
That no longer can be the defining matter of a man. It can't
Right.
just be you can take care of your family. So now it's got to be
Right.
you got to have the muscles, you got to act like a man because you're already being,
Yeah.
Thank you.
So such a good point, right? So traditionally, historically, right, masculinity, the man is defined as being somebody who takes care of the family, the provider, the protector, all that sort of stuff. So when a man, how would you say, is not able to do that, does feel very emasculated, does have this kind of an identity crisis, and it's totally reasonable to expect that person to look in other places in our cultural landscape for ways to sort of compensate or sort of demonstrate masculinity in another way, whether that's through muscles or athletic activity or all kinds of other things. So like sexual exploitation, for example, is something you might find also that I think a lot of that definitely is occurring. Kelly, were you going to say something about that?
Yeah, kind